Hello, friends. Today's chapter of the day is the 132nd Psalm. Can you believe we've been through 132 Psalms after all of the other chapters that we've read? What a blessing it's been. I hope you're enjoying just soaking up the truths and the wisdom and the attitudes and the relationship with God that we can see from all these Psalms. So for the 132nd Psalm, we're going to talk about really two things. First, the history of this psalm, what it's referring to, what its relevance is, and second, the symmetry of this psalm. We're going to see the symmetry between, man and God personified by David and the Messiah and Jesus. So let's start with the history. The history of this psalm is it is a psalm or a song of ascents, which is this is one of the songs or poems or chants that the Israelites would give on their way into the temple to worship God when they had their festivals. So this is one of the things they sang on their way up the mount to the temple. It is also what Solomon first said, at least portions of this psalm, as the Ark of the Covenant was being brought into the temple. You remember that David wanted to build a temple for God. God said, nope, I want your son to do it because you're a man of war, and I want your son to do it kind of with clean hands. Now, Solomon's hands got dirty later in his life, but that's another story for another day. But that's the history of the 132nd Psalm. That's where it started. David could have written it and Solomon was quoting it. Solomon might have written it. Someone else might have written it and Solomon was quoting it. But we know that it dates back to that important event in Israel's history. As far as the symmetry, what we see in this is we begin with the psalmist crying out for the Lord to remember David, and to remember David for two reasons. First, remember David's hardships. Remember the things that David had struggled with during his life. And there were a lot of them. He struggled with problems in his family. He struggled with people trying to kill him, to try to take his kingdom away, whether it was Saul before he became king, or Absalom after he was king, or all the other trials that he went through, some by his own doing, some not. And then the second thing that the psalmist is asking the Lord to remember is remember what David swore to you. Remember the promise that David made to the Lord. And the promise that David made to the Lord was, I want to have a place for your ark. You're more important than I am. I want you to have a temple before I have a house. Now, as it turned out, God kind of let him out of that promise and said, no, I want you to build your house. Solomon, your son, is going to build your temple. But that's where we start. What's really interesting to me about this psalm is as it develops, we see first the psalmist asks the Lord to remember David's hardships and his promise. And then as we read the rest of it, we read the promises that God has and the plan he has, and we think about it in light of the gospel, we realize that the way that God is going to remember the hardships and the promise of David is to accomplish an even greater promise for us, a completely undeserved promise by David or us or anybody else. And the way that the Lord is going to accomplish that greater promise is by the greater hardships of the Messiah. Because David struggled. Like I said, his struggles were in large part because of his sin. The Messiah struggled completely undeservedly. Christ came to this earth and he didn't have to. And he lived like a slave and he didn't have to. And he struggled, but he never struggled because of his own sin. He struggled and was punished and was killed and is forever in the flesh because of our sin. So that's what we see in this psalm. We see this great symmetry. We see the small hardships and the small promise of one great man, which are way greater than we could ever suffer or promise. But even that great man, his hardships and his promise were nothing compared to the response of God. The gracious response of God that David didn't deserve. That God would make this promise. There would be a horn to sprout for David. I have prepared a lamp for my anointed. His enemies I will clothe with shame, but on him his crown will shine. That's where we end. We end with Christ as the ultimate king. And he's the ultimate king because of his tremendous sufferings for undeserving us. So my prayer for all of you, as you think about these Psalms in light of the gospel and think about the beauty and the complexity of this writing. People treat the Bible like it's this dusty old book written by cavemen. I couldn't write anything this beautiful or this complex. You couldn't either. Appreciate it for what it is, the God-breathed, life-changing truth. That's all I got today. I hope this is helpful to you. God bless all of you.